You know, one of the things I get a lot of questions about is red meat and the health effects associated with consuming red meat, because it's a pretty significant part of my diet. It's one of the primary sources of protein that I utilize. And people ask about cancer, and they ask about cholesterol and heart disease.
Yep.
So how do we address that?
A lot of questions there. So let's kind of start at the beginning there, kind of how all those things came about. There's a lot of information out there in terms of development of different conditions and what may or may not cause those conditions to occur. You brought up cancer. That's probably one of the most misunderstood in the world. You know, at this point, it seems like everything is on the carcinogenic list. And what a lot of people don't understand is that once something has been deemed sufficient enough to go on that list, it never comes off. So regardless of what evidence the scientific community comes up with, you know, we could find enough research to show that it's absolutely, you know, as safe as drinking water. Once it's on that list, it doesn't come off. And so, you know, for a lot of the things talking about red meat and does it cause cancer, we really don't have a lot of solid information to truly make that claim in terms of the science. As far as cholesterol and the other things, the dietary guidelines is derived by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics along with Department of Health and Human Services, and they do that every 5 years, which is part of the USDA. So the last round of dietary guidelines was dietary cholesterol was actually removed from the list of foods that was considered to be of concern. So dietary cholesterol is not even something that is...
I think the word terms they used was there's no upper limit.
There is no upper limit for dietary cholesterol at this point. You know, they revisit those every 5 years, but at this point we have enough scientific evidence to show that there doesn't seem to be a concern with dietary cholesterol. And the cardiovascular portion of this, there's been several studies that have been done in a clinical setting. So, you know, for those of you out there who aren't really familiar with scientific research, there's a pretty big difference between an epidemiological study and a clinical study. Biggest difference is population size observed, and in a clinical setting, there's a lot more control on variables. So if you do an epidemiological study, you may be studying the entire population of a country. So you've got, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. Well, when you start doing statistical calculations, just the size of that data set can give you significant results because it's so large. Now, you know, the researchers that do this try to apply some statistical parameters to prevent that, but it's still something that happens. If your data set's large enough, you're going to see significant results. Something that we were all talking about a little bit earlier is the other issue with these studies is that the way the science was really kind of designed on the epidemiological studies is that, you know, that's a great way to observe a phenomena, right? So if you look at the whole population of a country, you may observe that, you know, this particular group of people develops, you know, whatever chronic disease at a higher rate than this population of people. Well, then when you go back to tease out what actually caused that, you can't find a causation from an epidemiological study. The best you're going to be able to do is see a correlation or relationship, and that's not strong enough to say X caused Y. So correlation does not equal causation. In clinical studies, they're not perfect, but you can get a lot more evidence to get closer to that causational relationship. So the difference would be, you know, instead of studying a population of a country, you know, we may bring in a group of athletes, you know, 20 athletes, 50 athletes, something like that. And if the facility will allow us, we can actually house them, and they can live there 24 hours a day, which gives the researchers the ability to observe every single thing they do, eat, their activity, all of these things, which gives us as the researchers a whole lot more capability to control for variables that you just can't do if you're in an epidemiological study looking at a population, because there's free living people and there's so many variables that you can't really control for.
I think there's two other things to consider, one being the healthy user bias, that in a lot of these big studies, people who tend to eat more meat tend to eat more food overall, more calories.
Correct.
They tend to smoke more, drink more, weigh more, exercise less.
Yes.
And people who opt for a more less meat in their diet tend to also have that healthy user bias. They drink less, smoke less, exercise more, go to the doctor more.
Correct.
And so any one of, if not all of those factors can dramatically influence the outcomes.
Absolutely.
Smoking being one of the biggest, of course. And another thing is relative risk versus actual risk.
Absolutely.
And
that's huge.
If, say, one person out of 1,000 were to get cancer, and that changed to 1.5 people out of 1,000, you would say that was a 50% increase in your risk of cancer,
Right.
which would seem pretty alarming.
Yeah.
But when you look at the
scary,
actual
yeah.
numbers from 1 out of 1,000 to 1.5 out of 1,000, you see that the actual risk is very little, even if that were provable with all those other variables that I just mentioned.
Absolutely. And you know, the studies that have been done clinically on red meat, the BOLD study at Penn State was a really great one to look at. It was done by Penny Chris Etherton and her team over there a few years back. They have one of those units where they can house people, and they fed them what they quote unquote healthy American diet versus the BOLD diet, which was beef and an optimal lean diet. And so the results of that study basically showed that the people that ate a higher amount of lean red meat through the day had a more optimal blood cholesterol level, and the biomarkers in their blood for, you know, suggesting cardiovascular conditions were actually reduced.
When eating a healthy diet
Exactly.
with regular exercise.
Yes.
Now, of course, now we've controlled for the fact that these aren't smokers, these aren't drinkers, these aren't overweight people with high blood pressure and other problems.
Unless they're smuggling in those cigarettes to the housing unit.
Right. Under that scenario, it's a very safe and we believe to be an optimal source of
Absolutely.
protein and micronutrients. And so that's a...
We've talked a lot in the past, you know, red meat is what we consider one of the true superfoods. And I hate that term.
I do too.
But that's...
If you're going to look at what is the most micronutrient dense, highly bioavailable, complete food that you could possibly live on in its entire, by itself.
Yeah.
And studies have shown that that has been done. Lengthy.
We don't recommend that.
Right. But the fact is, it is one of the more nutrient dense. I'll say one more thing about the cancer equation that people talk about. Because, and Dr. Rhonda Patrick covers this at great length, in great detail, and I can't even hope to repeat this in very short order, but I would suggest that people tune into what she has to say about the cancer connection. Red meat does, because it is so anabolic, it does promote growth in the body, that if you are the unfortunate individual who contracts for some reason, not caused by red meat,
Right.
but for any reason, genetics or otherwise, if you are one of the unfortunate people who does contract or acquire cancer, red meat is a very anabolic food.
Yep.
And it will accelerate the growth of all cells,
Right.
healthy cells and cancerous cells.
Exactly.
And so that is where you might start to see over time a population of people show more cancer because of the accelerated growth rate of those who are exposed to cancer.
Yep.
And that's just with specific to the IGF-1, not that it causes cancer. And by the same token, if you were to have cancer, you probably would want to consume foods that would not cause cells to grow and repair, because it could cause the cancerous cells to grow and repair as well, which is why it's ideal for healthy particular athletes.
Yes.
Because it does repair and grow cells
and promote growth, cellular restoration.
So it's optimal for that very reason. The same reason it's bad for cancer is the reason it's good for healthy,
Exactly.
hardworking, exercising individuals.
Cancer is a great subject, though, because we can look at this the other way, too, because a lot of people talk about there are certain diet approaches to prevent cancer. And prevention and treatment are two different things, too. And I think that's where there's a lot of confusion in that world. There's a lot of talk about, you know, keto diets or this, that, and the other thing for prevention of cancer. But clinically, you know, as nutrition professionals, we may use a ketogenic diet clinically for some types of cancers and or epilepsy. Like, those are the two main conditions we use it clinically. But I always tell people, you know, when was the last time you had prophylactic chemo, right? So there's a huge difference between the treatment and prevention. So just by having chemotherapy all the time doesn't mean you're going to prevent the cancer from happening, but that is the treatment that you would get. So it's kind of the same thing with the red meat. So by avoiding that, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to contract cancer, and vice versa. It doesn't necessarily mean that it may not be a good treatment depending on the type of cancer. So,
and with respect to how much meat or how much protein, really, our diet recommends for a hardworking individual, an athlete performing, say, 1 gram per pound, and that's of lean body mass.
Yeah.
And that would be true for someone that was dieting as well, as we discussed, because protein becomes important when you're at a calorie deficit. And so even if, at the very highest that we recommend, which is widely supported in the exercise community, at about 1 gram per pound, if you're a 180-pound individual, and lean individual, training, exercising daily, and we recommend 180 grams of protein, you may be getting 20 or more of those grams from the eggs that we recommend. You may be getting 20 or more of those grams from the yogurt that we recommend.
Right. Or if you had salmon that day.
Or salmon that day, another 20 grams. And so now you're down to needing about 120 grams of protein for the day. You're going to have to get your protein from somewhere.
Right.
And we've opted for what we think is the good, better, best scenario, the red meat, because the iron and the B12 and the zinc and the CLAs, to fill in the rest of that 120 grams. At about, what, 7 grams per ounce? You're
For
looking
red
at
meat,
about,
yeah, if it's lean red meat, you're right around
about
7.
16, 18 ounces. And we don't consider, certainly I wouldn't consider that to be a lot. 16 ounces is a large meal for a lot of us in this industry, but for smaller individuals, that's
for active
3 or 4
people.
ounces, 3 or 4 times a day.
Yep. So a normal serving for a sedentary healthy adult is about 3 ounces of meat, but that's a sedentary healthy adult. And if you look at our population, you know, we got a pretty sedentary population, but how many of them are healthy, right? So when people have compromised health, that immediately increases their protein needs a little bit. But like you said, that gram per pound is probably the very top, unless you are on a severely calorically restricted diet, which at that point there should be a pretty good reason for why you're severely calorically restricted, because we definitely don't recommend that very often. So
there you have it. There's red meat in a nutshell in the vertical diet.